So if someone had said to me when I was a teenager, unsure that I had a future, Bernie Swain, you're going to spend much of your life with leaders and great achievers of all kinds. Well, if I had the words to put together, I would have questioned their sanity. But the events of my life unfolded, I learned something very special about life. Our lives, yours and mine, are comprised of turning points, and these turning points define our success and accomplishment in life. Work hard, dream big. I mean, how many times have we heard that said, and we expect somebody to go out and succeed in life? But success and accomplishment, I've discovered, requires much more. Successful and accomplished people do work hard, and they look to the future to dream big things. But most important, successful and accomplished people remain in the moment. Successful and accomplished people have recognized the turning points in their lives. These are the opportunities that life itself gives us to reach our full potential. These turning points are actually forks in the road, where we have a choice to go in one direction or another. These choices, these opportunities, are simply given to us by the people in our lives and the moments in time we experience. Our success and accomplishment requires us to recognize these turning points, make good and wise decisions, and then commit ourselves fully. If you've ever seen that new hit television show, This Is Us, well, you know what I mean. The characters on this show face choices, forks in the road that alter their lives. Consciously or subconsciously, we see ourselves in these choices. Back in the 1950s and 60s, there was a baseball catcher who played for the New York Yankees named Yogi Berra. When Yogi was told that the first female had just been elected mayor of Dublin, Ireland, responded by saying, only in America. Yogi Berra was famous for saying things like this. So when I had discovered that years earlier Yogi had said something about turning points, well, it piqued my interest. When a reporter said to Yogi, "Yogi, you've had so many turning points in your life. How do you navigate them?" Yogi says, "I get to a fork in the road and I take it." Unfortunately, that's what most of us do. We pay very little attention to the turning points in our lives, those forks in the road. In reality, most of us are resistant to change. But what I've discovered over the years is that leaders and great achievers of all kinds do recognize their turning points and take action. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my life and some of the examples of my turning points and what I've learned about turning points. No one in my family ever attended college before. My mother and her family were farmers who grew up in Central Virginia and basically lived off the land. My father grew up with 6 siblings in a 2-room house in the poorest of mining towns in West Virginia. And when my grandmother couldn't always take care of him, spent part of his childhood in an orphanage. These were good people, but there was never any conversation in my home about my going to college. I had a teacher in high school. He was also the athletic director and the football coach. He was one of those teachers, like we heard earlier today, that you look up to. He encouraged me to go to college. In fact, he inspired me. I wanted to be just like him. And this is one of those turning points in life. I graduated from college, and by the time I was 36 years old, I had my dream job. I was being selected to be the athletic director of a major university. I had really far exceeded the expectations of that 16-year-old boy who may or may not have ever gone to college. Around the same time, a friend of mine sent me a copy of Fortune magazine. In the magazine was an article about what was then the largest lecture agency in the world. In the article, the author recounts how the head of this agency goes to visit the Gerald Ford White House to sign Gerald Ford, the president, Henry Kissinger, and Alexander Haig as clients to speak after they leave office. Near the end of the article, the author quotes Henry Kissinger, who was then the Secretary of State, as complaining about the high commission rate that this agency wanted to charge, and says, "Why don't I simply sign with one of your competitors?" The head of the agency responds, "I have no competitors." So I just happened to take the magazine home and I left it on the coffee table. A number of days later, when I came home, my wife says, "Have you read this article? He has no competitors." So she sat me down and she said, "You know, you come home 2 or 3 days a week and you complain to me about the bureaucracy of university life. I don't think you're ever going to be happy unless you can make decisions on your own." So over a period of weeks, she pushed and she prodded and she convinced me to walk away from my dream job. I know. It's a little hard to believe, but sometimes those simple forks in the road are U-turns in life. In solidarity, my wife quit her job. We had no plan, we had no experience, and we had no money. In order to start our new company and to have money to live on, we put a second mortgage on our home. Now we had $55,000 of mortgages on a $60,000 house at above 12% interest rate. We couldn't really spend money on an office, seemed kind of silly. But a friend of ours offered to rent us his stationery closet. His name was Chuck Hagel, and Chuck would later become the Secretary of Defense for Barack Obama. Now, to give you an idea what it was like to start work in Chuck Hagel's stationery closet, if we had to leave that closet for any reason, we would have to wait for one of Chuck's meetings to be over, because you had to walk from our closet through Chuck's office just to get out. Now, to give you an idea how you start a lecture agency with no experience to represent famous people, we would sit in our closet and think of famous people. It seemed logical. We would try to find a telephone number or an address. None of our telephone calls were ever returned, and our letters were returned from lawyers who said, "My client, this famous person, is under a written contract with another agency. Don't write us again or we'll sue you." Now, the thing you got to remember is in 1980, there was no internet. So for the very first time, the letters from these lawyers showed us that in addition to that agency that was in the news magazine article, there were 5 or 6 large agencies up and down the East Coast of the United States. That claim of no competitors was nothing more than a strategic boast. I used to sit in that closet late at night, and I remember putting my head in my hand and thinking to myself, what have we done? 12 months passes, in our stationery closet, and nothing has changed. We don't represent anyone. We now discovered there's 5 or 6 large agencies that we didn't know existed when we first started, and we were just about out of our mortgage money. Another 2 months passes, and I get a call from a guy named Steve Bell. Steve is the news anchorman for a new show that started in 1975 called Good Morning America. Steve had been under one of those written contracts. The contract had just expired, and they hadn't produced for him. I had briefly met Steve when I was at the university. I'd let him use the swimming pool. Somehow, Steve had discovered we started a lecture agency, not knowing we were in a closet, but started a lecture agency, and he called me and invited me over to his office. I got over to the office, and we talked, and I asked if we could represent Steve, and he agreed, and I shook his hand. On the drive back to the closet, I suddenly realized I hadn't signed him to a piece of paper. I hadn't signed him to a written contract. So when I get back to the closet, I try to justify it to my wife by saying, what good would it do to hold him to a piece of paper if he's not happy? That mistake on my part, that error in judgment, became a defining moment for us, because Steve then went and told his friends, other Washington journalists, that if you don't want to sign a written contract with these agencies, you can go with these new little guys in town, shake their hand, and walk out on them anytime you want. Suddenly, we felt very popular. Another few years passes, and I get a call from Alex Haley, the great author of Roots. Alex says, Bernie, I'd like to come and see you. I said, sure, when? Alex says, well, look out your window. I look out my window, and there he is, waving to me from a phone booth below. Alex used to come up to my office often over the years, and he would sit for hours at a time, and he would talk about family and relationships. During these conversations, Alex used to repeat a phrase. When an old person dies, it's like a library burning. When an old person dies, it's like a library burning. That pithy phrase stuck with me, and as time went by, I came to understand what he wanted me to know. Each life, our lives, is a storehouse of wisdom and knowledge. A library, he was saying, stuffed to the rafters. This wisdom and knowledge, he said, comes from the turning points in our lives, these forks in the road. And the choices we make are what gives us the wisdom, the strength, our success and accomplishment in life. Alex Haley's words had great impact on me, but it wasn't until a few years later that they took firm hold. In 1988, we get a letter from the White House asking us to interview to represent Ronald Reagan when he leaves office. There were 30 agencies invited, so it was a big deal, but it wasn't a big deal. The idea was you would take the 30 agencies, whittle it down to 15 and then to 7, and the top 2 choices would be presented President and Mrs. Reagan, and they'd make the decision. Now, no one in Washington, D.C., or anywhere in the world, for that matter, thought we would represent Ronald Reagan. But it would be good practice for us. We went through the interview process, and weeks passed after the last interview, and we hadn't heard anything. Now, Washington is a very gossipy town, so if you need to find out something in Washington, D.C., you can usually call somebody on the phone, and they can find out what's going on. But we didn't hear a word. Then another 2 months passes, and I finally get a call from Fred Ryan, who was President Reagan's chief of staff, and now the publisher of the Washington Post. I envisioned what he was going to say to me. Bernie, you've done a great job. You should be proud of what you've done, and accomplished in just 8 short years, but I hope you understand we must go with more experienced people. So I got on the phone, and Fred got right to the point. Bernie, President and Mrs. Reagan have selected you to represent them. I had no idea what to say. So I said, we'd do a good job. I'll be in touch, Fred, and I hung up the phone. I sat there that day thinking to myself how totally amazing it was that a president of the United States would risk his legacy on a totally inexperienced group of people. But as the years went by and I got to personally know him, I came to understand how this happened. Personally, Ronald Reagan was basically a small-town boy who believed in and was committed to entrepreneurism and the little guy. It had been exactly as Alex Haley had said to me years before. Ronald Reagan was true to and guided by those turning points, those forks in the road that formed and shaped his life. Alex Haley and Ronald Reagan were certainly two very different people, but they shared one thing in common. They recognized the significance of their turning points. Now, over the years, I've had a number of people come up to me and say, Bernie, you know those people you represent, they had opportunities and choices that aren't available to the rest of us. But my years of experience have taught me it's just the opposite. We all have our turning points in life. It just depends on what we do with them. Tom Brokaw. Tom Brokaw has been a journalist at NBC for over 50 years. In high school, Tom Brokaw was voted the most likely to succeed. And yet, in college, he flunked out of college. He didn't flunk out of college once, but he flunked out of college twice. And yet, Tom Brokaw's life changed exactly how my life changed when that teacher and my wife came into my life. Robert Reich. Robert Reich was our Secretary of Labor. Robert Reich is only 5'1". Most of his young life was bullied. And one of the boys who protected him was tragically murdered in the civil rights movement in Mississippi by local sheriffs. Robert Reich had two choices in life. Robert Reich could be angry about being bullied and the tragic murder of his childhood friend, or he could do something about it. Robert Reich, if you look it up, has millions of followers on Facebook and has become this nation's greatest advocate for economic equality and justice. Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris Kearns Goodwin is simply a student who writes a letter to a friend calling for the defeat of the President of the United States during the Vietnam War, much like a lot of us did, only to have that friend take that letter and get it published. Just as Doris was leaving for Washington, D.C. to become a White House fellow. And yet that friendship with that president that nobody anticipated set her on a path to become one of this nation's greatest historians. Liz Murray. You don't know Liz Murray. Liz Murray was a child of drug-addicted parents who went homeless on the streets and the subways of New York City. Liz Murray had only enough change in her pocket to make one subway ride. She could go have pizza with her friends, or she could take one last interview to try to get back into high school after all other interviews had failed. Her decision to take that one last interview led her on a path to graduating from Harvard. We're not all going to be presidents of the United States. We're not all going to be journalists or authors or champions for great causes. But who knows? So I would like to invite you to at least think about the potential in your life. Recognize the turning points in your life. Pay attention to what is happening in your life right now. What are these opportunities that the people in your life and the moments in time are giving you? And then make good and wise decisions. Remember, good judgment, even instinct like I had when my wife told me that I wasn't prepared for a future that I thought I was going to get, that good judgment and instinct are our best friends. And then finally, commit ourselves fully. We sat in a stationery closet for 14 months, fully committed to succeeding. The significance of these turning points is valuable for any of us at any age. They were valuable for me when I was 36 years old. But just think how valuable they are for young people who are just starting out in life today. Thank you.